In the prior lecture, we imported the EDMX into the project, into the DAL layer project for ASP.NET. Now, what is ASP.NET? ASP.NET is a schema that's done by Microsoft to handle user IDs, sign-ons, roles, all the sort of vanilla stuff. If you wanted to change it, then that's another story. But let's say we're going to stay with the schema that's given by Microsoft. It's pretty good for what we need to do. It's not bad. What I did was I imported the ASP.NET schema in a new folder called ASP.NET, and it's called ASP.NET.EDMX. Now, if you double click this guy, you open it up. If I look at the model browser, I'll see all the tables and objects described, and I'll also have the stored procedures, we call them function imports, described. Now, the good news, bad news is when you do this, a lot of it is built for you automatically. In other words, let's take a peek at what let's look at this and look at the ASP.NET.TT. Now, if you look, I called the EDMX ASP.NET. That's why all these objects, these dependent objects are ASP.NET. Just like the designer for a form, if you make changes to the EDMX, it'll generate this code automatically. So let's take a look at the TT. Under the TT file, I have, if you look, it looks like for every data that we have, I'm sorry, for every entity we have a file describing that entity. Let's take a look at roles, not the view of roles. And you know what, gee, this looks pretty similar. This looks pretty similar to a context level diagram, or not diagram, but class for the role table. Except for the methods here and this instantiation, it looks pretty close. Now, could I use this by itself? In other words, do I have to create my own context level by itself? And I think that was a question we had in class. And half of me said I know there's a reason why, and the other half said no, you can't do it. And I know the reason why now. I started looking at it; it just makes sense. Remember we talked about in the presentation layer. This project Voltaire. I want Voltaire to have a reference to the data link layer, but nothing else. So if you look, I'm sorry, not the data link layer, excuse me, the business logic layer, but nothing else. I don't want to have it have reference to the data link layer. And the reason being, I want to handle some of the objects and sort of massage some of the objects after the data link layer. So that and the other projects, the service projects, I don't want to have access to the data link layer. I don't even want these projects to know the data link layer exists. So it has to go through the business logic layer. Now here's the problem. These contexts are tightly bound with the namespace that I'm running on under the data access layer. So if I depend solely on these contexts, I can't use them once I'm in the business logic layer. Show you what I'm talking about. If I'm over in the business logic layer and I start to reference the base model, like right here where I say ASP roles domain model, that's my model. If I reference the base model, it won't like it because it doesn't have that EDMX in the business logic layer portion of the program. So if I want to sort of build that abstraction between the business logic layer and the data access layer, what I have to do is create my own domains and put them in a different project that it is inherited by both. So let's take a peek real quick. The business logic layer and the data access layer, I'm importing, excuse me, or I have a dependency between the business logic layer and the domain models and the data access layer and the domain models. So I created one called ASP roles, and what I did was I grabbed the context from the data access layer roles, and I implemented most of the base attributes. I didn't implement the methods, and I didn't implement the instantiation. So if you look at it, this is mostly created for me. I didn't type, in other words, I removed things. I didn't add anything else in. So the other thing is I want to make sure the presentation layer Voltaire has to be able to read those contexts unless I write them again. Example, when I go to, if I were to go to execute or read through or return a list of roles, let's say, or a list of users, I don't want to have to create my own context, my own, I don't want to create my own class like this again, right? So if I look at Voltaire, Voltaire should have reference or will have reference to the business logic layer, and when I need it, it will have reference to the context, not the data access layer. Okay, so that's why I had to split them up. So let's take a look what I did with roles. What I did was let's start from the presentation side. I created a form under the accounts because one of the things that the provider doesn't give you out of the box is role management. Um, let's take a look at roles. I gave you a quick form. I created two things in the form. One's called the object data source and one's a drop down. Let's take a look at what the object data source is. I've got the object data source pointed to Voltaire Business Logic Layer ASP.NET ASP roles .bll. It's pointing directly to, I'll show you, this guy. It's pointing to this class. And within this class, I'm going to call this method. So let's see how I do that. Next, it's going to ask me which method. Hope. Oh, maybe not. Let's see. Okay, well, believe me when I tell you, it asks for the method. So the list ASP roles method is this list ASP roles method. And it knows that it's in this type. Type name is like the assembly name. So when it gets data for this object data source, it's getting it from here. It's going to use this method. Makes sense. The drop down that I have is bound to the object data source here. And the object data source, or the drop down, excuse me, is going to use role name as what's going to be displayed and role ID from what's going to be bound to that control. So let's take a look. If I run this, I have that as my startup screen, the role screen, and under this I have volunteer, shown as my data role. Now you know what? Just to prove this out, I'm going to go over to SQL Server. And I'm going to create a new role. I have there's a method that comes with the framework, or comes with the ASP.NET schema. The method's called ASP.NET roles create role. I'm going to create a role called let's see, vendor. Or how about admin? Excuse me. So I push that role into the provider, and just to prove it out, I'm going to go to the roles table, take a look to see if it's there. Admin is there. I've got a new role ID. It comes out with a new GUID. It's automatically assigned. Alright, let's take a peek what happened. If I go back over to my browser, I'm just going to do F5 to refresh. And sure enough, admin and volunteer now are available. So how did this all work? Let's tie it all together. I've got the object data source in my form that's pointing to that class and that method within the class, this class and this method within the class. It's calling DAL list ASP roles. The DAL I have is an instantiation of ASP roles.dal. Let's go to the code. I right click and say go to definition. And sure enough, in the DAL, it's calling my own domain models, the ones I cut and pasted and created. And it's calling the ASP provider entity, which is the EDMX file. And it's saying, give me a list of ASP.NET roles, which is directly from that table. And I'm going to select it into my domain model. I'm going to fill out all my... Now, in the presentation, I only used role ID and role name. But if I wanted to, I could exploit any one of these guys. And I return the list. Now, the reality is, let's say this was a roles table and you were going to use, a roles form, and you were going to use it to assign roles to a user. Well, you don't want to show them all roles. You want to show them roles that they have. are roles that they don't have, right? What roles don't they have? Or let's say there were 5 roles and he had 3 of them and didn't have the other 2. Well, how would you display that? You probably want to display that in a drop down, but checkable. In other words, I'd want to check the 3 that are already selected and have the other 2 that aren't selected unchecked. And if they were to check or uncheck a role, we would go through and update the roles appropriately. So this is just like a quick and dirty way of showing a drop down, but this isn't reality how we would actually implement that. Um, so let's take a look. So what's my positive here? So what's the outcome? I have different layers of abstraction. I've got a presentation layer that can see a business logic layer, and that's it, except for the domain models. They can see the vanilla domain models. They don't have access to the data access layer. So if I did, let's say I skip all this and I just give them access to the data access layer, or worse yet, I put the EDMX inside the presentation layer. Well, that means that they can use anything that data access layer serves, which we don't want to happen. For instance, there are other things. There are many other things that this thing can do besides list roles. So let's go to the model browser if I can remember how to do that. It's sorry about that. I drew a blank how to bring up the model browser. So I'll close this and show you how to do it again. I open up the EDMX. I right click and I say show in model browser, and sure enough, the model browser shows up. So here we are. I wanted to show you what is available in the EDMX. Well, you can delete a role, check if a role exists, create a user. I might not want the service layer to be able to execute directly the create user. If I have this EDMX imported into any of the other projects, like let's say the business logic layer, there's nothing stopping them. Well, I could secure it with roles and all that on the database side, but if I don't even want to do that, I don't even want them to know that this exists. Then if I control within the BLL, they don't even know that it exists. So according to the BLL, from what I'm rolling serving the BLL, according to this, the only thing that's available right now is listing of roles, and I have a different one that I was working on, ASP membership get password. And nothing to do with the role stuff we were just doing. I was just implementing a member. But I probably wouldn't even implement this. Getting a password, in other words, show the real password for a user, probably not. So interesting stuff. So now down the road, if I wanted to, let's go back to, let's close the model browser. I couldn't find before, now I can get rid of it. the presentation layer of the service. Let's say I wanted the service to list roles or send back a message of list roles. Because this implements the business logic layer, there's nothing stopping me from taking this list of roles, and parsing into an XML file and sending it along the wire. And we're going to cover that in a later lecture, how to implement. Well, we already have the business logic layer read in by the service layer, but how we would have to call that business logic layer to list the roles and to create an XML out of it. That's going to be another episode. Great. I'm going to post this film or video, and I'm also going to check in my code so you'd see how that sort of dance works between the different layers. Thank you very much. Bye.